Hi there. In today's video, I'm going to show the beginnings of the process of creating a holiday sampler roll made from fabric and slow stitching. Now each roll will be unique and it will be based on the size and the length that you want. The premise is that I'm going to show you how I make the basis of my roll with fabric and batting and a few stitches to hold it together. And then I'm going to show you 5 prompts in the upcoming weeks where you can be inspired to create different slow stitching pieces right on top of your fabric roll. And the result will be a beautifully handmade fabric roll inspired by Halloween that you can display for the holidays or keep with your fabric stash. It can be used on books, to make bands, or even cut up and just used as a collage element. So to get started, today I'll show you the basis to make the fabric roll. Now to make my Halloween sampler roll, the first thing I do is I base the size width of my roll around the width here of the spool that I'm going to use. And this one is about 1.5 inches, so I'll do it a little thinner if I use this one. And this one that I just happened to find is a lot thicker. And so this is 2.5 inches. I don't know where I got this, but this would be the way I would go about doing it on this one. Today I'm going to use this old ribbon roll. It's just a piece of cardboard. I used up all the ribbon on it, but it provided a fairly sturdy spool. Now I do have some additional pieces of cardboard here that I'll just trace my ribbon spool around the size, and then I can cut them out just to reinforce this, and I'll adhere this down before I cover it with either fabric or paper. So I'll set that aside for now and work on that later. So now I know I wanted to make my roll less than 1.5 inches. So I always like to use a template. I have a template here and I'll make it 1.5 inches on both sides, just on a piece of heavy cardboard. And then I'll just cut this out, and I'll know that all of my spool has to fit smaller than this piece, this template. And then I just like to label it. So now from here I have my width down, and I'll try and keep my fabric just below this width. But as for length, I could go as long as I want. And I can always add on additionally because it is, after all, just fabric. So to start my piece, I like to use batting, and that's going to be the basis to give my roll a little more depth. I could use an additional piece of fabric if I wanted. I didn't have to stick with batting, but I like the way the batting feels when I'm actually sewing it, so it's a treat for me. So I'll cut a few strips of this batting to this width, and I'll just do the length of the batting here. So now I have 3 strips of the batting. I can create more if I want, and I'll attach the pieces here just with a few stitches, just so that I have a long roll to work with for this sampler roll. So now I have all the pieces sewn together, and as you can see, they're not perfectly straight, but that's okay. There is a little bunching here because I overlapped them, but it's not too bad, and it will just add additional texture. So now's the part where I want to add a layer to this batting piece. And I'm going to go with black, just because black or dark gray is very festive for Halloween. So again, I'm just going to cut strips out from this fabric. This one has moon and stars on it, and this is just kind of a black dyed fabric. I'll just cut it to the width here of this batting. To do that, I just cut it, make a snip, the width of it, and then I'll just pull it down the length. Produces a frayed edge where I tore it, but now I have a nice long piece. And I'll do the same thing here with this dark fabric. So now I have my batting that's sewn together, and I have strips of this dark fabric because that's what I chose to work with. So now I'll go about either attaching these strips as a whole to my batting, and I could trim down the batting if it's not thick enough, or I'm going to cut up these strips because I want to make it interesting. So I'll just put the strips on top of each other and just kind of cut them randomly, roughly 4 to 6 inch lengths. Can go a little smaller. And then I'll take the pieces and pin them on in place, one at a time on that batting. There's a little bit of overhang, but I can trim that off later. Coming around here. Take a pin. Just pin it in place to hold it where I want it to be. And then I'll take my thread and I'm just going to make tiny stitches all the way along to hold it in place. And whatever stitch you make is up to you. I'm just going to use a little running stitch. What I want to do before I adhere this fabric down, however, is I want to make a tab at the end because I like the way that looks on my fabric. So I just found a little scrap of fabric. I'm going to take it and fold it in half just to give it a little tab, and I'll tuck it underneath here. I'll pin that in place, and when I do my stitching, the end will come out as a tab. Now right now I'm just trying to cover my batting with one layer. So I'll do that stitching and then we'll come back. So here's the finished sampler piece stitched just with a running stitch down the length of it. I'll remove the pins. I'll remove the pins that held the fabric in place before the sewing. And on one end here I have a tab that I sewed over, and this will be the part that sticks out. And then on this piece I just folded my fabric over on the other end and tack that down with some stitches. So now I'll go and I'll very carefully just trim this fabric up, removing some of that batting. The little batting peeks out, that's okay, because I'm going to add additional fabric and embellishments. I just don't want to cut over the stitches. So there I have my first layer completely down. And now I just want to add a few little fabric scraps to my roll here, my sampler. And I could fold them entirely over the piece. I could just put them on top. I like to go to the areas that are overlapping the different types of fabric and cover those up somewhat. So I'll just take my time and plan out something here. I'll put that down, put that on, tack it down with a pin, and continue. And I like to use an assortment of colors. A lot of them are very festive colors, oranges and greens and yellows. They can be any length strip of fabric. And they can be in any formation as well. I think I'll come in here and overlap some of these pieces. And then I'll stitch these down with the same black thread just around the edges to tack it down. I can add a few more pieces if I want, and I can set some aside to add later as well. So here I stitched with a straight stitch all the way around both sides of my sampler here. So I have a really good basis. I can remove the pins, and then you could see that it'll fit right on my little spool. And again, the spool is optional. So eventually this is how I'll display it, or at least store it, just like this. Now as I add more sewing to it, it's going to thicken up, and I'm also going to cover this spool. I'm going to be sure to save all my scraps as well as the fabric that I used for the sampler roll. And for the prompt that's coming next, which I'll post the video in just a few days, try and find any scraps of ribbon that you might have that's either Halloween themed or fall themed. Now I'll show you the first prompt in just a few days. I normally post every Monday, but to get these 5 prompts out in succession, I'll post every Monday and every Wednesday until they're complete. Thanks for joining me today.